Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I apologize about having posted the wrong uh, uh, video recording last week, and we're going to have to try and make adjustments for missing that class. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out two chapters that we were going to study, which is hair and fibers and document examination. I'm not unhappy about that because those are the kind of wooliest areas of forensic science possible. And actually, both fields are in a state of real flux as many of their methods become challenged. So I'm not sorry about dropping those. I will restructure the calendar and post it again on Canvas for you. Okay, so we've been talking about fingerprints and fingerprinting. And let's have a look at how prints are actually detected. First of all, realize that very often a fingerprint, even a clear fingerprint, may be virtually invisible to the naked eye. Investigators will search likely places where useful fingerprints may be left. And they will often use a very bright light source shone from the side, something like that, in order to see places where fingerprints are actually present, but they will not be able to pick up any real detail. Instead, the fingerprints, which are referred to as being latent fingerprints, need to be developed. That is, they need to be brought into high contrast and put into treated in some way that they can in fact be preserved. They may often be preserved initially by photography, but they are preserved also by lifting them from the surfaces where they occur. And in order to do this, the fingerprints are dusted with a powder. In the case, if there's a light background or white background, for example, a kitchen counter or something like that is white, they would use a dark powder. If it's a dark surface, stovetop, something like that, they would use a white powder, usually an aluminum powder. Dark powder, very often very like toner ink, something like that. It's a carbon-based powder. So here's a kind of light source that they could use. Very, very bright light shone from the side may reveal the presence of a latent fingerprint. And they may also use ultraviolet light and other wavelengths of light to try and see where fingerprints are present. So this is a fingerprint here, which has been dusted with a black powder, a carbon powder of some sort. And you can see that what happens is, even in an old print which has dried, there are still, the print still has the marks of the ridges left in oils and in salts that have been left by the fingerprint. In a relatively fresh fingerprint, it may maintain its moisture for some time because of the presence of the salt. So salt, we say, is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture from the atmosphere and remains slightly moist, enough for the powder to stick to it. This is gently done with a very soft brush. And there are also other ways of doing it. There's wands that you can dust with these powders. So what appears is this very clear print. What kind of fingerprint is this? There, it's actually, I believe, a thumbprint. So this is pointing away from the thumb. So, and what is this? Go and look it up. Okay, so there are other ways of visualizing fingerprints, and they present in the fluids that we leave behind in the fingerprint. There are also some proteins which are exuded with sweat, and there are also skin cells and things present. And these can be developed by fuming with iodine, for example, and also by staining with dyes. Ninhydrin is a dye which specifically stains proteins, for example. And these methods are very useful for very old prints, which are completely dried out. And they are also used when, for example, fingerprints have been left on paper. And they may also be used, believe it or not, because fingerprints can be left on skin. And there have been some really famous cases which were solved from fingerprints lifted from skin. As extraordinary as it sounds, that can be done. And those fingerprints are usually visualized using a staining technique like this. So here is another method which is now very frequently used, and that is to use superglue. Superglue is a compound called cyanoacrylate, and it's the superglue itself, we normally use it just for sticking things together, but it actually vaporizes quite easily, especially if it's heated. And it goes into gaseous form, and the gas will actually settle on things like fingerprints. And it settles there, and it solidifies, and it makes a distinct white coating on the fingerprint. Very, very clear. It develops fingerprints extremely well. And it is very often used for developing fingerprints, for example, on a plastic bag, something like that. It's also used inside vehicles because fingerprints left on plastic surfaces are sometimes difficult to develop and lift. And it's used, they've simply put a little heater with cyanoacrylate inside the vehicle, close all the windows and leave it, fume it for a while, and see if any fingerprints become visible because of it. And there's also, you can also use there's a wand that you can use. It's a little tool which heats the cyanoacrylate, and the vapors emerge at the end of the wand. You can wave it close to a likely fingerprint and develop it that way. And this is what they look like. This is all of this here, the white, is actually cyanoacrylate. So this is a permanent marking like this, and this can sometimes just be lifted like that, but it can also be dusted. It can be developed as if, and then the dusted fingerprint lifted. So, and on porous surfaces, there's often some difficulty in visualizing latent prints, and this is where some of these alternative fuming methods become really important. So this is iodine fuming. Again, have a look here. And you can see this is skin, but there are distinct fingerprints left by somebody grabbing that person by the arm. In the old days, this could be very difficult to do because the markings of the skin underneath kind of can obscure it. But there is a fingerprint here. These are marks from skin. Here's a fingerprint imprinted on the skin there. These can be resolved by computer imaging. You can visualize this using computer imaging and remove the background noise from the picture and leave just the fingerprint, a picture of the fingerprint behind. So having visualized, developed a fingerprint like this, the fingerprint needs to be carefully preserved. And very often now, digital photographs will immediately be taken. If the fingerprint is on a small object like a bullet casing or something like that, the casing needs to be preserved intact as evidence, obviously, and it has to be very carefully packaged and treated so that the fingerprint is not actually wiped off. Very often they will try to develop the fingerprint. If it looks likely, they can try to develop the fingerprint there at the scene, but otherwise it needs to be done in a laboratory. It has to be very carefully packaged so that it doesn't rattle around and rub the fingerprint off. The simplest way of preserving prints is to lift them with adhesive tape. They're lifted with clear adhesive tape, and then that adhesive tape is stuck onto an appropriate colored card. So if you're lifting, obviously, if you're lifting a black print, you put it onto the white card. But if you lifted a print which had been developed with an aluminum powder, you'd stick it onto a dark card and with the full information, and it goes into the chain of custody. So as I told you before, in the old days, matching a question print to a standard print or something like that was actually done by eye. A very, very laborious and often extremely lengthy process. Nowadays, we can make use of digital imaging to do much of that work for us. And first of all, we can actually take a picture, take a print like this, and we can have it digitally analyzed into a digital format, which can then be entered into databases or whatever. But in addition, we nowadays can also take fingerprints digitally instead of the old inking thing, which is still done. The fingerprinting now can be taken electronically, and this means that a digital record is established and kept, and it can be checked against databases. So in analyzing these fingerprints, we are able to take a standard fingerprint and compare it to questioned image, and the machine itself can make the comparison and compare the differences between or similarities between the two prints. Here's a question print. You can see it's imperfect print. It's the double print. It doesn't matter. The computer image can still be resolved, clearly resolved, and it is being compared here to a file print for the number of similarities. And the similarities, again, that we're noticing are not the overall similarity of these are both loops, but the fact that there are minutiae in the same position on both prints. And this can be done electronically. The computer can pick up these similarities and highlight them. Each of them has to be verified by the person, by the expert looking at the fingerprint. But in addition, if it really is useful to do the inspection by eye before even a machine comparison is done. An expert will be able to quickly go through, check the minutiae between the two, and determine whether it is likely that this is in fact a match. So what the machine eventually does, it never comes up and says, this here is your person. Instead, from the database, the programs will draw a likely group, which have then got to be checked by eye, not by computer, but by eye, so that it is in fact a human being that decides whether or not we have a match. Now, this is all making use nowadays of automated fingerprint information systems, AFIS. And AFIS refers to those databases of fingerprints to which a question print can be referred. There is, first of all, on a statewide basis, the state may have their own databases, their own AFIS, and within the state, that kind of reference can be made. But the FBI maintains a very large database as well called IAFIS. And either one, if for example, in a case, if there is no hit in the state database, the print may be referred up to the IAFIS. The source of these prints varies from state to state depending on what their regulations are. In most states, anybody who is arrested who is fingerprinted, those fingerprints, no matter what happens to the case, even the case is dropped or whatever, those fingerprints are entered into a database. All criminals obviously found guilty, etc., they are fingerprinted. But in some states, they may also bring in fingerprinting from DMV, for example, other sources as well in other states that may not be legal. There is a little short movie for you to watch that tells you more about APHIS. So this issue of them being on a statewide basis, regionalized APHIS systems, is that they actually differ from one to the other. They are often based on commercially available programming, etc. And they use different computer systems, they use different algorithms, and they have great difficulty talking to one another. And it was for this reason that the integrated APHIS system, IAPHIS, was set up by the FBI. And this is 80 million, I believe it's now over 100 million prints. And they have incorporated into that not only newly taken prints, but they have digitized old images. They've digitized the old fingerprint cards and everything and included that in IAPHIS as well. And this is being moved now to a next generation, which is going to make use of other identification systems, in particular iris identifications. That is, you can use the iris of the eye and its characteristics as an identification system. And in addition, that can be plugged into computerized facial recognitions. You'll realize that this begins to become controversial because we are getting perilously close here to systems where machines can recognize people and do something about it. Send information, unwarranted information to authorities. So this is an area of some controversy. Okay, so here's a movie for you to watch, and this is a real case of that was solved by a visible print left on the body. Interesting to watch because they talk about how it was it was digitally analyzed to remove the background noise from the skin on which it was left. Okay, so let's move on, and we're going to talk today a bit about drugs and their usage and their abusage. And in particular, we're going to be mentioning all the way along how drugs are involved in crime. It's very, very frequent that drugs, and I include alcohol, play some role in crime, and also especially in suicide as well. Very often scenes of violence are associated with abuse of drugs and alcohol. So a drug we can really define as either a natural or synthetic substance that we ingest to produce some physiological effect. And that, of course, covers a multitude of sins, because we would include in that useful drugs which are non-habit forming, such as antibiotics. But our particular interest here is those drugs which have an effect, their physiological effect is on the nervous system, which produces psychological change in the person taking them. So this is very often the drug is taken for pleasurable purposes. And there are a multitude of reasons why people may ingest drugs or inhale drugs to whatever, get them into their system one way or the other. It is true that many drugs people only use very occasionally, and they use them under relatively safe circumstances, and there is no problem. However, many of the drugs that we do take into our bodies in order to produce these pleasurable sensations carry with them the danger that we can develop, first of all, a psychological dependence on the drug. And second of all, that we can develop an actual physical dependence. The drug becomes part of the functioning of our metabolism. And if the drug is suddenly withdrawn, we suffer very deleterious effects on our physiology. This physical dependence can be extremely powerful, but the psychological dependence, in actual fact, is probably much more important, and very often more powerful than the physical dependence. You can often relieve the physical dependence relatively quickly. In alcohol dependence, for example, the physical dependence is quite facile. It can be overcome within about 5 days. But the psychological dependence on alcohol is so powerful that it drives people back to drinking quite quickly in many cases. So don't discount this psychological dependence. We're going to hear about it again in a minute. So this physical dependence, it becomes a real physiological need. And it arises because the drug has been used on such a regular basis very often that its concentration very often never falls actually to zero. And as the drug concentration in the blood begins to drop, the person begins to feel actual physical symptoms of withdrawal from the drug. And at the same time, they will begin to have the onset craving, a seemingly irresistible psychological demand for the drug. This can be so severe that it can actually be classified as a sickness. And we often say that people are suffering from withdrawal sickness or abstinence syndrome. And it can be so severe that it can actually be fatal. For example, alcohol withdrawal produces a condition called delirium tremens, which may in fact be fatal. In the case of drugs like heroin, the opiates, those sorts of things, the physical withdrawal is agonizing. It involves muscle cramping, sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, a really agonizing process. But there are other drugs where, in actual fact, the physical addiction is minimal or absent. And these, for example, in marijuana use and in cocaine, these are commonly, obviously commonly used and commonly abused, but there is no physical dependence associated with them. But there's a very profound psychological dependence. And that may, in fact, be extremely difficult to overcome in a treatment program, for example. So the drugs which are in common circulation, which have a very high propensity for this physical dependence, first of all, alcohol. We have to talk about alcohol. We'll talk about it extensively because alcohol is the most commonly abused drug in our society. Heroin, barbiturates, then the synthetic substances like Vicodin, OxyContin. These things are very similar in their action to morphine and heroin, as we'll hear. And then this last one here, methamphetamine or crystal meth, is a little bit difficult to know. It is not clear where the boundary lies, and I've included it in this list for that very reason. These ones here, it's very clear that there is this distinction between the psychological and the physical dependence. In some drugs like methamphetamine, the psychological dependence is so powerful that it's almost impossible to distinguish it from physical dependence. Methamphetamine addicts, for example, have a continual drive to use methamphetamine because the crash after use is so profound. They become so debilitated, depressed, etc., if they don't have a certain level of methamphetamine, that they very quickly reuse. But there is argument about whether or not that is a true physical dependence. The very dangerous thing about about continual use, and especially about physical dependence, is that people develop tolerance. That is that the body needs a higher and higher dose of the drug in order to achieve the same effect. So this is true for all of these. And people who are regularly using, who are addicted, they end up taking a very, very high dosage. This is dangerous, first of all, because that has very, very bad effects on your health, etc., and can kill you in and of itself. But there is another situation where it becomes extremely dangerous. And that is if people come off the drug and for any length of time, and very, very quickly, they lose that tolerance. They lose the tolerance for the high dose. Then if they start using again, very often people will take the dose that they are used to, that they're used to taking, and now they have no tolerance and they overdose. And this is the frequent cause of overdosing on things like morphine and heroin and all of these synthetics like Vicodin and OxyContin, everything else. But even quite apart from the physical dependence, these drugs, remember, carry a very powerful psychological dependence as well. So this issue of psychological dependence is a very difficult one to understand, and it varies probably from person to person. Certainly emotional factors do play a critical part. And it's very often a matter that people imagine themselves to feel better when they are using the drug than they do when they are not using the drug. The drugs with very high psychological dependency propensities are things like marijuana, cocaine, hallucinogens like mushrooms, LSD, these things. Many of these things you'll realize for a lot of people is just they only occasionally use. They only occasionally use it. But there are people for whom this becomes a very frequent use, and it becomes built into their functioning. It becomes built into the way that they structure their day, how they work, etc., etc., etc. So we need to talk at some length about alcohol because it is the most important drug in general society. Alcohol use is very, very common, as you will realize, but alcohol abuse is also extremely common. And it's in the United States, about 90 million adults regularly use alcohol, and far more than that occasionally use alcohol. For most people, alcohol use, as with some other drugs, as we've mentioned, its use is occasional, social, recreational. That is fine, but we need to realize that even under those circumstances, alcohol can be associated with crime, with accidents, and with things like domestic abuse, that sort of thing as well. Even intermittent use, alcohol still has a very, very profound effect psychologically and physically on the people using it. It's the commonest addiction of all in society. About 10 million of these 90 million, so almost 10% of people who use alcohol at all, can be deemed to be alcoholic. This now we tend to avoid this word, but it's so descriptive for all of us that we'll just use it here. But very commonly now you'll see referred to as alcohol abuse syndrome. Alcohol is so frequently involved in accidental death, car accidents, falls, drowning. Very, very frequently, drownings are associated. People who drown are found to have been ingesting alcohol. Homicides, suicides, assault, domestic and child abuse, all of these things. It is so commonly associated that very often in these kind of incidents, as a matter of routine, blood samples or breathalyzer tests will be administered to people involved to try and tease out what the role of alcohol may have been in the incident. But quite apart from that, it has long-term health outcomes, which are extremely serious. And believe it or not, it is associated with cancers, especially esophagus, stomach, and bladder. These are all cancers which are associated with alcohol abuse. It can affect the heart and actually cause heart disease. Of course, you probably know it is the major cause of liver disease. But it also can affect the brain, and it can lead to dementias of one sort or another. And the unfortunate thing with alcohol is that there is this tremendously powerful meshing of the psychological and the physiological dependency. And we tend to associate alcohol with just feeling good, being in social situations where we feel happy and relaxed and no worries, etc., which is one of the effects of alcohol, especially in lower doses. And so it tends, the good times just don't end for people who are suffering from abuse syndromes. So let's just return to our general, we'll have some more to say about alcohol as we go along. Let's just have a look at different classifications of drugs and different types of drugs. First of all, these are 4 classifications of drugs, and these are drugs with neurological impact. Let's put it that way. These are not drugs, with like antibiotics and things like that. So we classify them. First of all, we recognize depressants, then a special branch of depressants. These are depressants, but they are recognized on their own because they have special characteristics. These are the narcotics. Then stimulants, and lastly, hallucinogens. These are the 4 groups that human beings make use of. So first of all, the depressants. Depressants are drugs which depress some functions of the central nervous system. Alcohol is the most important of all of the depressants. Now, what does alcohol suppress? Alcohol suppresses lots of things. It suppresses feelings of hunger. It suppresses feelings of inadequacy and things like that. But it also suppresses inhibitions, and it suppresses very useful inhibitions as well. It suppresses inhibitions which make us socially interactive and socially acceptable. Depressants often calm irritability, and very importantly, they calm anxiety. This is often a driving feature of their use and abuse. There are many, many, many different depressants. Alcohol is the most important one. Anti-anxiety drugs, various substances of abuse, which, for instance, the glues and solvents act much like ethanol in some ways. then there are a set of others which are used as soporifics, as things which induce sleep, and these, very importantly, are the barbiturates. And the barbiturates are used as sleeping pills very often. They may also, in some circumstances, be used for other purposes. For example, for relieving epilepsy and things like this. Their use can be structured so that they don't have deleterious effects. So we are going to spend some time talking later about alcohol and the way in which it works. For these drugs here are the tranquilizers. These you will have probably heard of: Xanax, Valium, all of these things. They are intended, their proper usage is to relieve anxiety. And usually there is little, if they are used properly, there is little other effect. However, they can very rapidly develop a strong physical dependency. And quite apart from the fact, obviously, you're taking them for psychological reasons, there is a strong risk of psychological dependence. It varies from person to person, but the withdrawal from these tranquilizers, especially if they've been used for a long time, is done very, very carefully, because the physical addiction is extremely powerful. And so when people are taken off the use, they don't stop. They usually taper the use over a period of weeks. The dose is reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced, so that you shed the physical dependence without bad effect. Okay, then the next group of depressants are special, and these are the narcotics. Narcotic refers specifically to things which have been derived from opium, and substances as well, which mimic the action of substances like that. The primary substance which is extracted from the opium poppy is in fact morphine. Opium is a morphine compound. And in order to do so, this is poppy fields, and they is extracted from the seed pod. They cut the seed pod, and the seed pod bleeds the latex, and the opium is contained in that latex. Now, these are depressants. They have a very useful depressant effect, and that is that they depress the sense of pain. So they're very powerful pain relievers, and that has been their use by human beings for many, many thousands of years. But unfortunately, they also carry a very high risk of physical and psychological dependence, because the pain that they can relieve is not only physical. The pain they relieve is also psychological, and they can produce these compounds, all of them, opium, morphine, heroin, all of them closely related. These produce a sensation of great well-being. Every pain that has ever existed is relieved, and the person is left with this overwhelming sense of well-being, but they are physically debilitating as well. The person becomes very sleepy. It gets very difficult to do ordinary day-to-day things, although people develop a tolerance and are very often able to continue functioning even while they are powerfully addicted to these substances. So there's a little bit of a nomenclature. Any drug derived from a poppy is called an opiate. And then that distinguishes it from synthetic things which mimic the activity of the opiates, which we refer to as the opioids. And you'll know that currently in the United States, there is an opioid epidemic. There's an epidemic of opioid addiction. So morphine opium really refers to the raw product the latex and things. That just as it is can be smoked, and that's how it's been used for many thousands of years. But that raw opium can be refined, and the substance we extract from it is called morphine. And morphine is very widely used as a pain reliever in a medical setting. It's one of the commonest uses of it, and it's extremely powerful. But it can be, another substance can be synthesized from morphine, and that is heroin. And heroin is actually two morphine molecules joined together. And it, in terms of usage, it is easier to make a solution of heroin, and it becomes a drug of choice for abuse because it is very, very powerful. These two molecules of morphine are broken down very rapidly in the body into two molecules. Morphine, and you're getting, from ingesting a small amount of heroin, you get a very big hit of morphine. We can trace morphine use even in Egyptian mummies and in from many parts of Asia and Europe. Morphine and morphine use, opium use can be traced historically. But the problem with these narcotics is that the physical dependence can be very rapidly established, and it is extremely profound. And withdrawal from these substances can be absolutely excruciating. Heroin is very often, as you probably know, morphine as well. There are the various routes of usage. First of all, it can be injected. Heroin is dissolved in water, easily dissolved if you heat it, and it can then be injected into the bloodstream. Morphine can also be injected, but morphine can also be ingested, although it is extremely bitter, but it can be ingested. And heroin can also be smoked, as can raw opium. And this is important. This use of heroin as ingesting, inhaling it as a vapor, is called chasing the dragon. And chasing the dragon, they are indeed chasing a dragon. Very often they end up, the dragon catches them. This is important because this is an easy route to addiction. It's very commonly, teenagers are initiated into heroin use through this practice, chasing the dragon, and then move on. The demand, the tolerance very rapidly develops, and this doesn't provide them with a high enough dosage, and they begin then to inject. So this feeling of extreme well-being is really the goal of, that becomes the be-all and end-all of the addiction. There are some other narcotics associated with poppies as well. It's very interesting that this one plant produces so many psychoactive compounds. But there's just one other, as I'll mention, and that is a substance called codeine. It's only produced in low amounts, but it's very widely used as an anti-cough drug. So it's very often used in prescription cough syrups. That's important because, in fact, these cough syrups become a subject of abuse, and you can actually become addicted to the cough syrup. And this is a common thing with young teenagers, that they become addicted to the codeine in the cough syrup. The real problem now, the heroin and morphine heroin abuse, that is one story all on its own. But here comes another and really dreadful story, and this is the abuse of synthetic opioids. Now, these are not derived from opium. These are completely synthetic substances whose action mimics the narcotics. So you get the same kind of pain relieving and sense of well-being, et cetera, that you would from morphine or heroin. But these, OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet, Pethidine, many other drugs like this became developed because they're relatively easy to synthesize, and because their pain relieving qualities can be, they thought, be targeted with little risk of addiction. This is how many of them were marketed, especially these, OxyContin and Vicodin. These throughout the end of the 1980s onwards, these were very, very widely marketed to medical practitioners as being as powerful in their pain relieving ability as morphine was. But they were told that there was little risk of physical dependency associated. This is completely untrue. They in fact have a very powerful physical dependency, and an even more powerful psychological dependency develops. The market was absolutely flooded with these drugs from one shore to the other of the United States. Doctors' offices, pharmacies were flooded with marketing and with incorrect information regarding the likelihood of addiction processes setting in. Even now, that it's got such a bad reputation, OxyContin is still prescribed to nearly 1 million patients for treatment of chronic pain. And the problem with them is that they really do make people feel good. And they became drugs of choice, especially in poor areas, where people are under economic pressure, no jobs or poor living conditions, etc. But they could get prescription for the painkillers from their doctors, and they could survive as long as they had this feeling of well-being, etc., that the pills gave them. But they have all the same problems associated with heroin abuse: development of tolerance, development of strong physical dependence, etc. And there's another problem, and that is many doctors became very leery of continually renewing prescriptions. Long after the source of pain had disappeared, people were still coming back begging for another prescription for these drugs. People are very often then driven to buy the drug on the street, and then it becomes very expensive. And when they were unable to afford buying it on the street, their next recourse is to go to something cheap, like heroin, because heroin is readily available and it is cheap. And that this now provided a route to heroin addiction, as well as funding this tremendous epidemic of opioid addictions. There is another one another synthetic opioid which you will hear about, and we are hearing about it more and more frequently, and this is fentanyl. Fentanyl is extremely strong, very, very powerful, and it's become a drug of abuse, but it's also very frequently mixed in with other drugs in unknown quantities, but it's done to boost the strength, for example, of a heroin, of the heroin that a dealer deals, but it can have unpredictable effects. All of these, if in overdose, have a common feature, and that is that first of all, they induce profound drowsiness and then unconsciousness. But along with that, they depress respiration. So as long as you're awake, that you'll basically, your breathing may be impaired, but usually if you're awake, you continue to draw breath. But if people go unconscious and their respiration is suppressed, they die very quickly from lack of oxygen. And this is the mechanism of fatality in overdoses of these drugs. Fentanyl is very often a contributing factor in these deaths. And this is the situation that I described earlier. Very often people will try to give up their drug, even give it up for a week or whatever, or go into treatment, and very quickly lose the tolerance that they had developed. But when they go back to using the drug, they take the same dose that they took before when they've stopped. And it's far too much, and they overdose and they die. And these drug overdose deaths are now the commonest accidental death form in the United States. And these drugs will routinely be tested for at autopsy because they are so frequently involved. Now, methadone is another synthetic opioid, but methadone was developed as a medical treatment for heroin addiction, especially, and it's also used for morphine addiction, these two. Methadone suppresses the craving for the drug. It produces few side effects, and there's no disabling high. In other words, people can take methadone and they can lead a completely normal life. They can hold down a job, etc., etc., etc. Methadone is extremely useful, and it's used to wean people off heroin use. That's its intent. But it actually also is itself addictive, and it's very it's very difficult to get people off methadone. They can carry on using it for a very long time, but it's in fact becoming a drug which is widely dealt illegally, and it's becoming, methadone abuse is actually becoming more and more common. Okay, our third group are the hallucinogens, and this will be one you'll be surprised at, that marijuana is actually a hallucinogen, even though its hallucinogenic effects are a particular kind. So what we mean by a hallucinogen is these drugs interfere with the brain's ability to properly analyze and process sensory input. Hallucinogens produce distortions of perception. So, for example, marijuana use. What is one of the commonest impacts and most rapid impacts of marijuana use? Your sense of time is completely distorted, right? You are unable to discern the length of passage of time. That's just one effect, not the only effect. And the hallucinogens, they tend to cause a change in the normal thought processes and in the way in which we perceive the world around us. Those, obviously, most people are taking hallucinogens for pleasurable effects. So many of these are we appreciate as being pleasurable. A hallucinogen like LSD, for example, produces changes in perception, visual hallucinations, and these things which are entertaining. But they can also produce very profoundly frightening and damaging changes in perception. Unfortunately, they're usually limited to the time that the drug is active. It doesn't necessarily have long-lasting effect. So here's the commonest, of course, of all of the hallucinogens. And this is the marijuana, which is derived from this plant called cannabis. And it's cannabis sativa is the full name for the plant. It's only mildly hallucinogenic, and but at very high dose, it can be quite powerfully hallucinogenic. People can actually hallucinate at very high doses. And in addition, at very high dose, very disturbing effects can manifest. Feelings, profound paranoia, these sort of things, and panic can be induced by high doses. But normally, in social usage, the dosage is lower. It's the most commonly used illicit drug, but as you'll realize, it's being legalized very widely in the United States. And it really, its effects are sufficiently mild, and the associated abuse is sufficiently rare that it really can safely be legalized under most circumstances. There's only one circumstance which is very unclear about marijuana use, and that is its impact on our ability to drive. Obviously, we're going to hear alcohol. There are very strict rules, very, very strict rules about how much alcohol you can have before you drive. Marijuana, that has not been established. Its long-term impact on health, again, is unclear because the range of usage is also so great. The substance itself is tetrahydrocannabinol. That is the actual psychoactive compound. THC, it's often abbreviated to. But there are various other substances in marijuana as well. Some of them have no psychoactivity, like cannabidiol. This is CBD, which is often now touted for all sorts of health impacts, although those are really unclear. There are no good, there's few studies showing the really beneficial effects of use of CBD. Here it is, probably familiar to many of you. There's one thing, important thing about cannabis, and that this is a plant which has been farmed for many thousands of years. But in recent years, it has been farmed with specific idea of increasing the content of the psychoactive resins which are present. And so special breeding programs have been undertaken. And the plants nowadays produce vastly more resins than they did even 20 years ago. And this is concentrated very often in buds. That is their common name, buds. And these have been specially bred. So what we're dealing with, this is not your parents' or grandparents' pot. These are very often extremely powerful. So it induces feelings of well-being, anxiety release, but in some people, and especially at high doses, it can actually induce anxiety. It can even induce panic. There are distortions of space, time, body space. It changes in taste, hearing. And one of the useful effects used medically is it induces hunger. You get the munchies for a very good reason. It's acting on hunger centers in your brain. And that is used very often. People who are under cancer treatment, this sort of thing, if they are not eating, they're finding difficulty eating, a small amount of marijuana, of the tetrahydrocannabinol compound itself can induce a feeling of hunger and get them to eat. There is no true physical dependency in marijuana use, but there's a very, very high risk of psychological dependency. And the risk is that people build it into their day, and they begin to smoke regularly throughout the day, remembering that the plants are now extremely powerful. People are actually operating under a deficit, even though they may appear to be completely normal. They're operating under a psychological deficit, a neurological deficit. And we do not always understand what the impact of that is. For example, what is the impact on driving of being high? It's difficult, very difficult to say. Now, in long-term usage, when people use very regularly and they use it for a long time, there is one psychological downside which has been widely recognized, and that is that its continual use is demotivational. People lose their sense of anxiety, of ambition, or even the desire to do things, even to do pleasurable things. This all begins to sound very much like an induced depression, which indeed is a consequence of the long-term use of marijuana. Other hallucinogens, well, you've heard of LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, which I'll mention again, and one which is extremely common now, MDMA, ecstasy, Molly. All of these kinds of drugs are actually hallucinogens. They operate by impacting different parts of our perceptive ability. So one of the most profound and historically important of all of the hallucinogens is LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. It's called lysergic acid. And lysergic acid has something in common with all of the other hallucinogens as well. But lysergic acid especially interferes with our ability to process sensory input, such as visual input and auditory input. And normally, when you hear something, it's routed to the hearing centers of the brain. Okay, when you see something, it's routed to the visual centers of the brain all over the place for analysis. LSD interferes with this, and we begin to get false perceptions. You see music, you hear taste. All of these, this is all reflects the distortion of the channeling within the brain, but it is usually temporary. And people may find it entertaining. They may also find it creatively stimulating. Now, here's a very interesting one. And these are mushrooms. This is psilocybin. And psilocybin is a hallucinogen which is commonly taken recreationally. And it is a really powerful hallucinogen, but it has, in many cases, a strange effect. And it is not only, it can produce hallucinations, visual hallucinations, this sort of thing. It changes our perception of color and things like that. It often enhances it. But it also creates a strange sensation of connectedness. And people who take it often report profound feelings of connectedness to everything, to other people, the universe, etc., etc. And for this reason, it has evidently featured prominently, along with other substances like peyote and these sort of hallucinogens, in religious ceremonies for thousands of years. The current interest in psilocybin, however, is that in its antidepressant effects. And it has been reported that even limited use under medically controlled circumstances can provide profound relief from depression, for long-lasting profound relief from depression. And this is a subject of much research at the moment. So the last group that we'll need to talk about are the stimulants. And the things like the depressants and those narcotics, these are called downers because they are depressants and they tend to produce feelings of relaxation and tranquility, loss of anxiety, etc., etc. The stimulants do the opposite. They are uppers. They ramp up the metabolism and they ramp up brain activity as well. They impart a sense of great urgency, if you want to put it that way, in our psychological thinking. And there are many of these stimulants that are in use. The most important ones are the amphetamines, which are often called speed. And then the drug most commonly associated with crime in the United States, apart from alcohol, and that is cocaine. And cocaine comes in two forms. There's a refined form of cocaine, the rich man's cocaine, the snowy white powder, which is usually sniffed, but can also be injected. And the poor man's cocaine, and that's what they called it, which is crack cocaine. So all of these substances, all of these stimulants, they increase this feeling of alertness and activity in the brain. And they often also depress the appetite, and they relieve feelings of fatigue. So traditionally, they have been abused by people who need to work a lot, for example, at high pace. These amphetamines, cocaine, these sort of things are the drugs of choice for people like that. But many people find that this rush that they produce, this sparking of the brain, is intensely pleasurable, and it also makes people feel powerful. Now, these two, amphetamine and methamphetamine is a relatively modern form of amphetamine, which can be smoked or injected, and then these produce this rush in the body, followed by a period of intense feelings of pleasure, engagement, and everything like that. But unfortunately, very frequently, as the concentration drops in the blood, there's a profound crash. Now, these do not, in general, have strong physical dependency, but they have very, very powerful psychological dependency. And it's hard to distinguish between, it becomes so profound, it is hard to distinguish between the two. And many people will say that the psychological dependency is actually a physical dependency. It's just a physical dependency of the brain, not of the rest of the body. These addiction to any of these stimulants is very, very difficult to overcome. So cocaine itself is also extracted from a plant, which grows in South America, and that has been its traditional use. It was traditionally, still is used. People chew the leaves to relieve hunger and to relieve altitude sickness. But refined from the leaves is the substance, cocaine, which increases feelings of alertness. And it also stimulates the brain so that it's like it's the radical alternative to boredom in a way. And that is what people find attractive about it. The trade in cocaine in the United States is absolutely enormous. Billions and billions of dollars worth is trafficked from South America northwards. And it funds an entire criminal world, which gets it from the leaf to the refined form into people's noses here in the United States. About 10 million people worldwide are regular users of cocaine, and it can be divided into two kinds of usage. There is a social usage. It doesn't have physical dependency that develops. And so it is often, many people who do use it only use very occasionally and may use it socially. However, the psychological impact is so great that many people are regarded as being addicted to cocaine, even though that is not a physical addiction. So it's often referred to as cocaine use disorder. Same as we would say alcohol use disorders. Okay, so this here is, that's refined cocaine. Now, this here is crack cocaine. Crack cocaine, first of all, let me explain. This powder here is usually sniffed. It can, under some circumstances, people do develop a habit of injecting, but most usually it is sniffed. And that's a very inefficient way of using it. In fact, the amount of substance that makes its way into the bloodstream when you sniff it is relatively low. So you have to use quite a lot of this, which is advantageous, of course, for the drug dealer. But you can take this and you can process it together with baking soda in certain circumstances. It produces this substance, which is crack cocaine. It's still cocaine, but it is immensely powerful. If you want to think about it this way, it concentrates all the effect into a small amount. And for a small amount like this, somebody can get a lot of usage. So crack cocaine became a drug of choice in the end of the 70s, then through the 80s, became the drug of choice in poverty-stricken areas because it was so cheap and so easily available and so widely available that there was an actual crack cocaine epidemic. And associated with that, tremendous amount of crime, and also just people addicted to crack for whatever reason, even though it might be that the physical addiction is not that powerful, but certainly they can be described as being addicted to crack nonetheless, would become obsessed simply with chasing the drug, getting the drug under any circumstance, and not doing anything else with their day except using. And this produced a dreadful epidemic, and with very, very disastrous societal consequences, not least of which was the response of authorities to it, which was to treat the crack cocaine addict almost as severely as they treat the dealers. And this is the origin of many, many very oppressive drug laws, which punished possession and dealing with crack cocaine with very, very heavy prison sentences. And the prison population in the United States exploded as a result of the crack epidemic. There are many reasons why people still use crack, but there are many reasons why its use now is relatively rare compared to what it was in the 1980s. And part of it is certainly that many of the crack addicts actually died or ended up in prison on very, very long sentences. But it became societally unacceptable in a way. And all the combinations of those things led to its use tailing off, fortunately. But rich man's cocaine is still widely used and widely abused. And unfortunately does not, when people are caught with it, it seldom results in the same kind of treatment, sentencing, etc., that people who have crack cocaine in their possession are subjected to. So the drug control laws in the United States try to look at drugs from the point of view, first of all, what is their potential for abuse? What is the potential for the two aspects, physical and psychological dependence? And last of all, what is the medical value of a particular drug? And they are classified then into these different classes, in different schedules. Schedule 1 is the most controversial of all. And Schedule 1 drugs, they have a very high potential. They're regarded as having a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical abuse, no accepted medical use. Well, let's just have a look at them. These are Schedule 1 drugs. Heroin, fine. You can understand it's a street drug, very high potential for abuse, very deleterious effects, etc., etc. However, heroin is used medically. It's used in cases of intractable pain. It is one of the last resorts for intractable pain, for treating intractable pain. Look at this one, marijuana. What's marijuana doing? High potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use. Well, its medical use is limited, but high potential for abuse. Well, it used to be regarded that as being a gateway drug. If you started with marijuana, you would end up injecting heroin. That was the theory. And so they thought that if they made marijuana Schedule 1, made possession of marijuana and dealing in marijuana were extremely serious crimes, they would cut off this gateway effect. Of course, now marijuana is being removed from Schedule 1 and is actually being legalized very widely. Psilocybin, does not have a high potential for abuse at all. And it may, in fact, have very profound psychological benefits if it's used under correct circumstances for relieving depression, etc., etc. This is all under research study at the moment, the same for LSD. So wrapped into the Schedule 1, certainly there are drugs on Schedule 1 which deserve to be there. But in addition, there are a number of drugs on Schedule 1 which should be re-examined, in my opinion, anyway. Schedule 2 drugs, they have a high potential for abuse, but they have medical use. And these are things like cocaine, PCP, amphetamine, barbiturates, all of these things. They do have a high potential for abuse. Some of them have a high potential for developing both physical and psychological dependency, but they are regularly used under medical circumstances. Schedule 3, they have less potential for abuse, and they have a widely accepted medical use and are frequently prescribed for use by a regular doctor. So things like barbiturates and barbiturates and probably tranquilizers, these sorts of things. But also codeine, which I've told you is often prescribed to relieve cough, and things like anabolic steroids, which can be medically used. But notice here, anabolic steroids are drugs of abuse as well. So Schedule 3, less potential for abuse, but that's not to say there's no potential for abuse. There's some potential for abuse. So their use is restricted to prescription by a registered medical practitioner. Other drugs, Schedule 4, very low potential for abuse with widely accepted medical use. Many of the tranquilizers, the diazepam tranquilizers, these sorts of things, again, under prescription from a doctor, not over the counter. Schedule 5, low to no abuse potential. Medical use, into this comes over-the-counter drugs, things that you would buy, cough syrups, whatever you would buy over the counter, any of those things, but also things like antibiotics, that sort of thing. Okay. All right, so let's stop there for today, and then we'll carry on tomorrow. Okay.